Tonight, we have a brother here from Ghana, and I would like to call your attention once again to the program. I'm going to make a few changes. Dr. Ansah is formally the acting head of the Foreign Language Department at the University of Ghana, Legon. He is presently a senior lecturer at the Institute of Journalism and Communication, University of Ghana. He has taught French for a number of years. Presently, he is in the United States at the University of Wisconsin, studying their School of Journalism. Tonight, he is here with us. He is going to present to us the topic of freedom of the press in Africa. Dr. Ansah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by thanking the organizing committee for Black History Week, which has made my coming here possible, and particularly to thank the Bruners, whom I have known for a number of years, and through whose instrumentality I was invited to come here. I think it is appropriate that when there is a Black History Week here, attention should be turned to both sides of the Atlantic. I think in the course of the week, you have heard a lot about the blacks in this country, on this side of the Atlantic, and I think it is a matter of interest that we should also look at the other side of the Atlantic. And I have chosen on this occasion to speak about one aspect of life which brings Africa into the contemporary period, something of crucial importance in national and international understanding, but something which faces a number of problems in Africa for reasons which I shall delineate in the course of my talk. And that is why I'm going to talk about the freedom of the press in Africa. Those who have observed the press scene in Africa since about 1960 see a certain amount of regression in standards of journalism in Africa. They see that the dynamism of the colonial period is not evident today. That newspapers, which were very conscious of their responsibilities, are now only mouthpieces of the government. In the pre-independence days, the press was relatively freer than it is today, and the press was used effectively to mobilize opinion in the colonial struggle. There were many political leaders who founded papers like the Evening News, which was founded by Nkrumah, and it became a very important weapon in the struggle against colonialism. They knew, of course, that the newspapers reached not the masses, but only a small percentage of the population. Nevertheless, it was important because it reached those who call the opinion leaders, and these people had views which could influence others. So these political leaders haven't realized the power and the importance of the newspaper, were not willing to give it up after independence. The situation in the post-independence period is that the governments have taken over the press, which was mainly foreign-owned, and private newspapers are very rare in Africa, except perhaps for Nigeria, even though in Nigeria, where there are private newspapers, the government-owned press is far larger. In most of this talk, what I will say will mainly concern English-speaking Africa, because French-speaking Africa never had a strong newspaper tradition, and therefore, in their case, one can speak of continued stagnation rather than regression. How has this situation come about? How was this regression caused? Because in considering the function, the position, or the role of a newspaper in any country, one has to look at two major factors: politics and economics. And if we use these two factors for gauging the performance of the press, the reasons why the press happens to be so weak in Africa will become obvious. Politically, the constitutions which most countries had at independence guaranteed freedom of expression, even though these freedoms of expression, movement, etc., were severely limited by clauses which gave wide discretionary powers to the government. Because there were the traditional laws which we had inherited from Britain, sedition, libel, contempt of court, which were often invoked, sometimes arbitrarily. But even when there were these guarantees, constitutional guarantees, the government did not very much respect these. Now the situation has got worse, because even the constitutions which promised nominal freedom have been suspended by the cascade of military coups we have had in recent times. Now, the freedom has been completely eroded, so that in the previous situation, where governments which wanted to suppress newspapers had to invent a number of tricks to do so, now constitutions do not exist, and a lot of things depend on the discretion or the indiscretion of whoever happens to be in charge of information. And it would be erroneous, because to think that freedom of the press has been eroded only with the advent of military regimes in Africa. The military has been either tolerated, welcomed, or accepted in Africa, in most cases, because the civilians did not do much better. And therefore, if press freedom is further whittled, it's more a question of the mechanics of working this out, where a decree can be issued anytime, finding something unacceptable, whereas constitutional channels had to be used on the previous occasion. In addition to this political factor, there is also the economic factor. Most of the newspapers of the previous period, that's pre-independence period, which had wide circulation and which had some respectability, were owned by foreign groups. And these were acquired by the new governments. Also, individual parties set up their own papers. individual entrepreneur did not have enough money to get into the newspaper business for two main reasons. Firstly, because of the wide range of illiteracy, circulation is very limited. And of course, no newspaper can ever hope to survive mainly on the basis of its circulation. Secondly, because of the low economic activity and the lack of competition, it's difficult to expect much to come from the sale of adverts. So if you are in a country like the United States, where you make dozen types of toothpaste and toilet paper and dog food and cat food and things like that, it makes sense to advertise, to draw consumers. Not that one product is necessarily better than another, but at least people have certain brand names in their head, and it's good that they buy this particular type. Therefore, people will advertise. In many African countries, where there is one type of soap, or if there are two types, they are both manufactured by the same company, or one type of toothpaste, it doesn't make much sense to advertise. And usually if companies do advertise, it's mainly to reduce their tax obligations, not to get a wider market. And therefore, as a business venture, they considered getting into newspapers unprofitable. And consequently, this became unattractive to indigenous businessmen. So that there does not appear to have been much of an alternative to the government owning and controlling the press. The present situation, therefore, is that while the government owns the radio and television in almost all African countries, the bulk of newspapers either belong to the government or to the ruling party, and since there is usually one party, whether it belongs to the government or to the ruling party, it all comes to the same thing. The journalists who work on these papers, as the state-employed journalists, face a number of difficulties. The first difficulty they have, of course, is that he who pays the piper calls the tune. And since discretion is the better part of valor, not many journalists have been willing to bite the finger that feeds them. Therefore, sometimes even against their better judgment, editors have had to write things in which they did not believe. It also happens that the people who work on the state press are not generally well paid. Not that others are much better paid, but they seem to be still worse off than other people. And therefore, it is difficult to attract a lot of good talent into the newspaper world. The editors and the people at the higher levels, of course, are well paid. Usually, they get about 4 or 5 times what they are intrinsically worth by the values and standards of salary in those countries. But they are so well paid that they remain forever beholden unto the governments which pay them. They do not have alternative resources, and they know that if by accident they lost their jobs, they couldn't get a third of what they were getting on the government press. And therefore, they have remained on the government press. Occasionally, a few university graduates have gone into journalism. most of them have felt frustrated because their bosses, the editors, who had the final say, who took all the responsibility, and who had their masters to please, have censored their articles beyond recognition. And they have said, if this article is going to appear under my byline, then it should contain at least this paragraph. They have disagreed with the editors, and most of them have felt so frustrated that they have all left and ended up as public relations officers with private organizations. Further, because of this situation, the journalists have no job security. There is a very rapid changeover of editors, and not only with the change of government. When there is a change of government, which happens fairly frequently in our part of the world, the editors are almost automatically changed. When there was the last coup in Ghana in 1972, the editors of the newspapers were, as by convention, dismissed. And a commissioner of the new military government explained it in a very simple way. He said the government had dismissed the editors to save them from embarrassment, because they had been singing the praises of the previous government, and now there was a new government which was opposed to the previous government. For if they retained the same position and had to sing the tune of the new masters, they would become too embarrassed. So it was to save them from this embarrassment that in their own interest, they were removed. And it sounded fairly logical as far as it can go. But in addition to these problems, which may be considered peculiar to journalists who are working on the state press, there are difficulties which are faced by almost all other journalists working on smaller papers which are independent and which do not have a lot of viability. For one thing, people are very unwilling to give information in Africa for fear that they might lose their jobs. Sometimes fairly straightforward information is denied any inquirer, and a lot of things which should normally be public knowledge finds itself under some classification or other. And people fear that if they give any information which might turn out to be embarrassing to the government, they might lose their jobs. And therefore, they will not give any information. And if you remember that the government in many African countries, even including Nigeria, happens to be the largest employer of people, you see how difficult it is to get any type of information. The government can also impose sanctions on obstreperous journalists and newspapers in a number of ways. Because of the shortage of foreign exchange, there are very strict and rigorous import licensing rules. To get newsprint, you need import license, which is issued by the government. And if you're on the wrong side of the government, you will find it very difficult to get import license, and you might get out of business quickly. I will shortly give an illustration of how this weapon was used very cleverly against a paper with which I was associated. Sometimes also, the journalists have suffered physical harassment at the hands of the authorities. I think the most glaring case was the case in Nigeria. When a journalist reported a straightforward incident about lack of facilities in a school, and the military governor of one of the regions in Nigeria took particular objection to that piece of information. Not that it was not true, but that it was embarrassing to him. And I think he was more offended that this information was published on a day which happened to be his birthday. And therefore, he unilaterally had this man condemned to strokes of the cane. And the Nigerian journalist protested. He was incarcerated for a few days. The Nigerian Journalists Association protested vehemently, and the matter eventually went to court because despite the presence of the military government, there is a considerable amount of judicial independence. The military governor was judged to have falsely imprisoned this individual and to have wrongly had administered unto him corporal punishment, and a considerable amount of damages was imposed on him. One other factor which makes the work of the journalist particularly hazardous in Africa is that many people do not understand, many ordinary people in Africa do not understand the fundamental liberties of the individual and do not, therefore, appreciate it. Perhaps as a result of the colonial tradition, people fairly seriously believe that the government has a right to deprive you of your freedom, and that if the government does not deprive you of your freedom, then it is doing you a favor. I remember once when I wrote a fairly controversial article in the paper I was editing. It came out on a Friday. On Saturday afternoon, I went out, and people were surprised to see me, because rumors had started spreading that I had been arrested for what I had written. But I said, why should I be arrested? Because what I said was true. I said, yes, but this is displeasing to the government. And as if they were prophetic, I was arrested later, and it didn't surprise anybody. And one finds oneself in this situation. It does not only apply to journalists. Occasionally, when there are rumors of counter coups and things like that, you find that individuals are arrested and detained without trial or any process whatsoever. When these people are released, you find either them alone or them together with their relatives thanking the government for having released this individual. And you get reputable organizations like the Christian Council of Churches, the Muslim Association, the House of Chiefs, sending congratulatory messages to the government, thanking the government on its magnanimity in having released this individual. It doesn't occur to anybody to find out whether the government had any business depriving anybody of his freedom to begin with. So that when you operate in that atmosphere, whatever foolish measures the government may take do not surprise anybody, because they think the government has right over your freedom, and once it is displeased with what you have done, it can take any measure. I said a while ago that the government has several ways in which it can silence a newspaper which is too vocal and which tends to find itself on the government's wrong side. I shall illustrate by citing the case of a paper of which I was editor in 68, 69, and 71, 73. It was a paper called the Legon Observer. When there was the first military coup in Ghana in 1966, it became obvious that Ghana had got to that sorry pass because people had not had the opportunity of expressing themselves. And the new military government promised freedom to everybody. And there were some academics in the first university of the country at Legon, who thought that a forum for discussion should be provided so that at least we could go back to the tradition of public discussion, because we felt that was one of the ways in which we could avoid reverting to the stultifying dictatorship of the previous period. And we started a fortnightly independent paper which had no ideology, though we always wanted to believe we were on the side of the underdog. But what we wanted to do was to provide a forum for discussion so that views which were considered unorthodox could be expressed. And we worked on this paper on a part-time basis. We were, unfortunately, by force of circumstances, forced to take an almost consistently adversary position vis-à-vis the government. I say by force of circumstances, because if you wanted to express any opinion which did not please the government, you couldn't do that in the government-controlled papers. And our paper happened to be the only outlet. And therefore, people who had anything to say against the government brought it to us. And once it did not go against the rules of libel or contempt or anything, and we thought it was well written and in good taste, we published it. We ourselves also put ourselves in this adversary position because we reasoned that anybody who came into government to do certain things. And that if he did them, well, he was just earning his keep in an honest way. It was not newsworthy. It was when he didn't do them that it became newsworthy. But then we were forced further into this position because the other papers were so sycophantic that sometimes we had to take a position which was less moderate than we normally would have taken. For example, when our former president died, Nkrumah, reading any of the newspapers, the government-controlled papers in Ghana, one got the impression that the coup of 1966 was a terrible mistake, and that Nkrumah was the greatest thing which happened to the black man, that Nkrumah was absolutely without blemish. And of course, our paper had been able to come into existence because Nkrumah was no longer around. And we remembered the stultifying atmosphere under which we had operated between about 1960 and 1966, February, when people were imprisoned without trial, when university students were paid from the party headquarters to spy on their fellow students, and some students got arrested and detained for long periods. And since everybody was painting Nkrumah as an angel, we thought we should not paint him as a devil, but that we should paint him as a human being and tell at least the other side of the picture. And in telling the other side of the picture, it looks as if we went a little far. Opinions are divided on this issue. But at least we wanted to redress the balance, that if the other papers had not lost their good sense, we may not have gone as far as we did. But we went on, occasionally with some harassment and indirect suggestions from the government that we were going a little too far. The only thing that was, people didn't know whether we belonged to the right or to the left. Those of the right thought we were too much to the left. Those of the left thought we were too far to the right. And what was most consistent about us was that none of the three governments under which we operated liked us. The military government under which we were established thought we were saboteurs. The civilian government which came thought we were very subversive, and the military government which overthrew it also considered as subversive. But they more or less tolerated us. Then, last year, it became obvious that the other newspapers were, the government's grip on them was becoming firmer and firmer. Not only did they deny themselves the right of commenting on what was happening, but even in simply reporting what was happening, they could not do. It's about exactly a year ago today, there were troubles in the University of Ghana involving students and military people. And the military government hysterically overreacted and closed down the universities, the 3 universities of the country. This we thought was a very serious matter. But instructions went out from the Directorate of Public Relations of the Army to the newspaper editors that nothing of this should be published in the newspapers except the statement that the government would issue on the matter. Because if they went into details, the government would get embarrassed. It involved military people harassing some civilians, including a pregnant woman. Well, they said this to the other newspapers, and they knew they couldn't say this to us. And they, of course, knew that even if they suggested, and we had not made up our mind to write about it, once they had suggested, we were therefore going to write about it. So we naturally came out with a straightforward, objective report about what happened. Were bought by interested people and burnt. They went to the shops where we were being sold. Young boys who sell them on the streets, they bought copies of them. Some of those who did the buying were seen to have gone in jeeps, but we don't want to. We feel that some interested people felt that they had to do this. And therefore they didn't want people to at least get to know just the bare facts. And this practice continued for some time. Then, in July last year, we wrote an article, a straightforward article, telling the government that they were making nonsense of their claim to power. Because they came into power, the previous civilian government had imposed certain austerity measures. The military government came round and they behaved like Father Christmas. They gave back privileges to those who already had privileges, and they gave back to everybody what the previous civilian government had taken away from them. I mean, senseless things like I'm a university lecturer and I buy a car, or I'm a civil servant and I buy a car, and the government pays me a certain sum every month to buy gas. And if you live in a government bungalow, which most civil servants and university personnel do, you pay 7.5% of your salary as rent. Where if you get it on the open market, you will pay much more. The civilian government said, let it be 15%. That would be better, because if you live in that type of accommodation, you don't even do maintenance. All maintenance is done by the Public Works Department. The military government came and abolished that. So you go back to 7.5%. So they behaved like Father Christmas. And then they started subsidizing imported foods like sardine, corned beef, and things like that. We advised against it. And we pointed out that they were behaving like Father Christmas, and Santa Claus was never a politician. Therefore, they shouldn't behave like Santa Claus. But everybody thought we were just opposing because we wanted to oppose. Then, in July last year, in fact in June, they took certain measures which showed that after 2 years, they had realized the folly of their policies, and therefore went back and did exactly what the previous government had done and on which the government had been overthrown. So we wrote an article entitled Administering the Bitter Pill or Lessons in Government, and showed the government that it's not very easy to stand outside and think it's easy to rule a country. And we produced some statistics and said that the last public speech of the previous government was very closely echoed by the new military leader, and said it shows clearly that most of our problems are not created by individuals, but by certain circumstances. Therefore, people should not be too quick to reverse the policies of the predecessors. The government reacted very sharply. They said what we were saying in effect was that the previous government said certain things and did certain things and it was overthrown. That they have come into power, they are saying the same things and doing the same things, and therefore they should be overthrown. In private conversations with army officers, we tried to explain that what we were saying was that they, the new military government, had minimized the problems of ruling a developing country. And we were warning anybody who wanted to take advantage of the present difficulties to take over, that they could not do better, just as these other people had done better. And the government was not amused. And there were long debates as to whether they should withdraw our license, because in Ghana you need a license to publish a newspaper. And according to the decree, for reasons which appear to him to be sufficient, the Commissioner for Information, without assigning reasons to any third person, can withdraw the license. There was a debate in government circles as to whether our license should be withdrawn, but they decided not to do that. But for some very odd reason, the radio, which is controlled by the government, the television, which is controlled by the government, and the government-owned papers launched a series of attacks against the Legon Observer. We were saboteurs, we were nation wreckers, we were fifth columnists, we were this, we were this, we were this. And we were due to come out one Friday. Then on Tuesday, we got a letter from our printer, which said, "Dear sirs, due to circumstances beyond my control, I regret to inform you that I can no longer print the Legon Observer." So we went to see him. Said, "We're coming out on Friday, at least give us some notice." He said, "No, your paper has become too hot to handle. And I know I've broken a contract. I'm prepared to pay any compensation, but I won't touch this." He did not tell us that any pressure had been put on him. But our own investigations showed that he had had difficulties getting import license. He was not only printing Legon Observer, he was making toilet roll, he was printing books for the government, he was doing a number of things, and printing the Legon Observer was about 5% of his business interests. But he was being squeezed on all other fronts. And when he tried to find out why people were changing their attitude towards him, he said, "Well, we don't even know why you're asking this question, because if you print the Legon Observer, why should you be surprised that you are not getting import license easily and things like that?" And he wanted to keep his business. So he dropped us. And since that time, we have gone through the length and breadth of Ghana. It is impossible to get a printer. So why did the other man stop printing? Anyway, if I print, I don't know, one person said he wanted to hold consultations before he could handle the paper. And then he said he didn't have printing ink and a lot of problems. And therefore, that paper, we hope that it has been temporarily suspended. but this was in July last year, and the prospects of its coming up are rather slim. Of course, when people are talking about the press in Africa, people like me and like others, they usually see the problems from the point of view of the journalist. I will try very briefly to see it from the point of view of the government. It is obvious that the functions of the press in Africa are bound to be different from the functions of the press in an industrialized country, because the social and economic problems and atmosphere are completely different. It runs through the whole of African politics. In Africa, we have had to solve a lot of problems simultaneously, problems which advanced countries have solved consecutively. For example, in Africa, you've got to think of the problems of the workers' rights, problems of welfare amenities, problems of national integration, problems of modernization, human liberties, all at the same time. Anybody who learns the history of the Western countries will know that the workers have not always enjoyed the rights that they are enjoying now. The moment when they had child and female labor, where child labor was exploited, we are far from that period. Problems when countries were trying to get together. The last province of France, Provence and Savoy, were added in the last century. But developing countries have to cope with the problem of national integration. They have to look at the reconciliation of competing interests at the same time. Question of the workers' rights. So all these problems come together and have to be solved at the same time, whereas people have had a long time to solve one problem against another. There is also the problem of rising expectations and rising frustrations. When the Western countries were developing, they didn't have any standard of comparison. Nobody said they were underdeveloped in relation to another place because there was no other standard of comparison. We find ourselves in a situation where we've got your standards to look at, and our people are rather impatient to get to these standards. So there are rising expectations, and because of problems, there are rising frustrations. And therefore, it's generally accepted, both by journalists and people in government, that a newspaper should aim at mobilizing people for national problems. That a newspaper has a certain, at one of its functions, that of being a transmission belt, conveying government activities and decisions to the people, trying to forge a sense of national unity among the people. That the newspaper will say other things, but this is one of its functions. Try to show people what the government is doing for this region, that region. If you are going to have a sense of national unity, there must be a certain sense of belonging. See how adequately our development projects and how fairly they are distributed along the country. For if the government constructs a highway here, it may just be mentioned in passing in this country. Might find it more profitable because of the structure of the press to sell some toothpaste instead of giving space to this type of thing. But in our situation, the newspaper has the function of helping to mobilize opinion, helping generally in the education of the people. And this is very well accepted by the journalists. They accept this social responsibility. But they also think it is their right and their duty to go further beyond this and evaluate the wisdom behind governmental decisions, and also to anticipate certain governmental decisions. And this is where the conflict occurs. That the government believe that the newspapers should not compound the difficulties by pointing out certain weaknesses. But then the journalists feel that especially in situations where Parliament has been abolished by the force of the gun, where there is no public forum for discussion, the press has got an increase